preserves a light color, so the tannins that are in your beer that come from the malt, those oxidize and start to darken up the beer. So if you've got a nice light lager that's going to turn dark, that's one of the signs of oxidation. When you have like an IPA that starts to turn an ugly grayish color, that's a sure sign that's been oxidized. But even if it starts turning a little bit browner than it used to be, that's a good sign that it's been oxidized. It reduces haze. Reduces the contamination threat. That's a little bit less of a threat because your finished beer's got alcohol in it, so at that point you're probably less likely to pick up a bug, but it does reduce that. It's pretty simple, it's pretty inexpensive. I've had this conversation with a lot of people, so I've heard a lot of reasons against. One of the reasons is that bottle conditioning needs oxygen because you got to re-ferment it in the bottle, right? But the truth of the matter is your yeast does not need oxygen to create carbonation. It doesn't need oxygen to ferment, so you don't need any oxygen in your bottle in order to carbonate. So that's a bit of a myth. Yeah. Well,
it's a myth.
You'll still do
it. Time consuming? It's not time consuming. I guess if you do a lot of research and build your own little gadgets and stuff, it's fun for me, so I don't consider it time consuming. But once you get it all set up, it doesn't take any longer than doing a normal transfer. I don't have any extra equipment to clean or anything. It's the same. I'm using the same amount of tubing and everything, so it's not difficult. After you sit through this, I've got like a 5-step process. It's pretty easy. It's definitely anything anybody can do if you've already started kegging beers and you're used to using CO2 and forced carbonating. Then you can do a closed transfer, no sweat. But there are a couple legitimate reasons against. So if you like the taste of cardboard and lots of other gross oxidized flavors, then that's another reason why you might not want to do this. And also if you want sauce to reclaim the Cuyahoga Cup, so if you want to enter crappy beers into competitions, I don't recommend doing this. Neil brought me up here because Wizard of Saz is coming up, and he wants all of us to try to bring our A games to that competition so that we can retain the Cuyahoga Cup. So there's a lot of oxidation off flavors. Not all these are going to be caused on this list by closed transfers, because some of these are like oxidized malt and hops before you even start brewing. But yeah, there's a whole laundry list of gross flavors. Actually, some of them don't sound too gross, like toffee, honey, cloying. I mean, you don't necessarily want that in your beer. It's going to throw off the style of the beer you're trying to make, though. If you get an IPA that starts turning toffee and cloyingly sweet because of the oxidation, that's not a good thing. You want it to be bright and fresh and clean and dry. It can cause astringency, obviously cardboard paper we already went over. Soy sauce is a really common one, especially if you've got a darker malt beer that's been aged for a very long time, which people tend to do. I know usually at the Christmas party, I don't know who brings it in, but someone always brings in a Sam Adams Triple Bock that's pretty old. It's about 20 or 30 years old, and it's always it tastes like soy sauce. It's disgusting.
That's Thomas Hardy.
Well, I've had the Thomas Hardy one too. Yeah. You can get metallic off flavors, soapiness. I don't really know what goaty tastes like, but that was
horrible.
Yeah.
Hey, speak for yourself, Mark.
My wife grew up on a goat farm, so I know what they smell like, but I don't know what the taste is. They don't smell great.
You haven't lived.
Cheesiness, that's usually when the hops are oxidized before you use them. And sweats out vomit, everyone's favorite butyric acid. Grassy, woody, blackcurrant leaves, cattiness, usually from the hops. Rotten fruit and vegetables, and cidery and vinegary. None of these are necessarily qualities that you want to have in your beer. So I won't go too far into it. This is my only science-y type slide that I have here, but basically this is just describing the different laws on how oxygen is going to get into your beer, especially when it's already packaged, when it's in the keg, when it's in your bottle. So Boyle's law talks about how the pressure increases as CO2 is forced into a confined space. So when you're fermenting, CO2, well, it's not just CO2, it's any gas, but primarily with beer, when you're forcing CO2 into the confined head space, whether it's in a bottle or a keg, the pressure is going to increase. When the pressure is increased, if we skip down one to Gay-Lussac's law, or Guy-Lussac's law, the pressure changes also with temperature. So it's not only by forcing extra gas into that little headspace, also if it warms up, that pressure is going to increase. And if the temperature decreases, when the temperature decreases, that headspace gas pressure is going to also decrease. And then probably the most important one here for what I'm going to be talking about is Henry's Law, where it talks about how as the pressure changes in that headspace, that's going to force gas in and out of the liquid. So as you have a higher pressure in your headspace, that's going to force the gas that's in that headspace into your beer. That's how you force carbonate. But it's important when you think about it in combination with Guy-Lussac's law, because if you have a setup, or if you're not good with holding temperatures, if you have a lot of fluctuations, it gets warm, it gets cold, it gets warm, you're constantly pushing those gases in the headspace in and out. So that's going to accelerate the possibility that your beer is going to oxidize, because you're consistently pulling gases from that headspace in and out. And any small amount of oxygen that's in that headspace is going to react more quickly with your beer as it gets pushed in. And you're increasing the chance that it's going to get pushed in the more you have temperature fluctuations. Give it enough time, it's going to oxidize no matter what, but changing the temperature is going to make it work even faster.
Is that only the bottle, or is it the same in the keg?
Same in keg.
It's the law.
How far of a temperature swing would cause an issue?
You've never plugged your cap in and it's sucked air?
Well, I mean, it's sort of scalable, right? So, I mean, a little bit, a couple degrees is still going to matter. It's still going to make it change.
Okay, so the more consistent you can keep it, the better.
Yes, it's not like an on-off switch where, like, as long as you keep it within plus or minus 10 degrees.
More like plus or minus.
You want to keep it as close as you can. I mean, no one's got a perfect regulator and perfect chest freezer or whatever you store your beer in. But yes, Dennis?
Question: if you oxidize your wort for fermentation, if you haven't
Outside aeration's a myth.
no, not hot. Anyways, you know what I'm talking about. You put oxygen in your wort for fermentation.
Right.
If you fill the rest of your fermentation vessel with CO2, would that be okay?
Why would you?
Well, yeah.
I don't know.
So,
You still do that
so there's a
before you
difference.
put
First of all, there's a difference between oxidation and adding oxygen to your wort. When you're adding oxygen after you boil your wort, right before you pitch your yeast or right after you pitch your yeast, you're not trying to oxidize your wort. You're trying to add oxygen that oxygen's going to use. Oxidation is a chemical process where an electron gets pulled out. It's called that, and because oxygen is the most common oxidizer, it's probably what's going to cause your oxidation. But there's other chemicals that'll cause oxidation, other different types of metals and stuff. So when you're adding oxygen to your wort to feed to help the yeast, you're not trying to oxidize it. You're just trying to add some oxygen that the yeast can use to help build sterols that'll help build the cell walls while it's reproducing.
And fill it with CO2, would that do
It's
any
going to
good?
fill anyway. Once it starts
Yeah,
flooding.
I mean, if you're oxidizing, I just did it. If you're adding oxygen to your wort, what's the point of keeping a perfect CO2 headspace at that point? Plus, once it starts fermenting, it's going to slowly push all that oxygen out.
Pre and post fermentation are two
Is CO2 heavier than oxygen? So like,
I'm gonna get there.
okay.
I am not a very firm believer in the CO2 blanket. I have a couple slides of misconceptions.
Hey Andrew, I got a question for you.
Yeah.
You know, I went to Anchor Steam Brewery, and like they do like open fermentation in like a room.
Yeah.
Like so, like I assume humans can walk in that room and not die from
Was
CO2.
there foam on top of that?
No, it was open. It looked like swimming pools of beer. It was wonderful. It was like heaven. Like, I wanted to jump in there. It was
So I've never done open fermentation like that, so I'm not an expert on it, but I would imagine that they wouldn't want to leave that beer open forever. And is your question involved in why doesn't that beer oxidize, or is it in...
right, yeah. Like, because, I mean, like, humans go in there, humans breathe oxygen, right?
Right.
There's so much CO2 coming out of the beer that there is a CO2 cap on the beer.
As long as there's poison on the beer, it's got a cap.
Okay, here it is. CO2 blanket. Here's a common misconception that a CO2 blanket is going to protect your beer from atmospheric CO2. The only real time that there's going to be a CO2 blanket protecting your beer, which there is a time, is during active fermentation when it's consistently replacing that CO2 that's going to be mixed and pushed off. So it's not a blanket that stays on it, this static thing. It's CO2 is constantly being pushed off so that all the CO2 that's close to the liquid is going to, any oxygen that mixes with it, the chances of it getting down to the liquid is less because it's denser down there by the liquid. The only other time potentially that you could have a CO2 blanket, like if I took some CO2 out of this tank and just gave it a quick purge, that CO2 is going to sink straight down to the liquid because it's a little bit colder. So you are going to have a very fleeting instant of a CO2 blanket, but it's immediately going to be mixing, and just the act of pushing it in is moving things around in there. And anytime you have that kind of movement, it's going to start mixing with all the other air that's in there.
So if you're bleeding a keg, will
I don't believe in bleeding kegs.
Oh, you don't?
No, I mean, it's better than not bleeding a keg, but I'd rather fill the keg up. I'm going to do a demonstration here. I'd rather fill the keg up with something and then push that liquid out. And that'll make sure that all the gas that's left in that keg after you push the liquid out is CO2. It takes a lot of time. So I sat through a presentation at the 2016 HomebrewCon in Baltimore on oxygen ingress. It was an excellent presentation, way more in depth than this one. But he had a nice little graph that talked about how many times you have to purge and at what pressures you have to purge. And it was something ridiculous, like you had to purge 30 times to get essentially all the oxygen out of that headspace. Like, it was a complete waste of CO2. You think pumping an entire keg full of star sand out and filling it with CO2 that way is a waste? It's nothing compared to how many times you have to purge to effectively get rid of, I mean, you're never going to get rid of all of it, but to get rid of most of your oxygen. Yeah, Tim?
I was curious, you think you could pump from one keg to the other while you were purging air? So if you daisy chain like 3, 4 kegs to make this worthwhile, and take water and pump it to the next keg with CO2 and cascade that through.
That would work.
Yeah. You think it'd be efficient?
It would be more efficient than purging the headspace. Yeah, I think that would work. That would be efficient.
It would take the amount of CO2 it took to fill up each of those kegs. And as long as you're using low PSI, then you're only filling them with like 1 or 2 or 3 volumes as opposed to...
Enough to move the water.
Yeah, enough to move the water. You don't want to do it at a higher PSI because then you're just compacting your CO2 and putting more in there than you need.
Unless you're in a hurry.
Unless you're in a hurry. Yeah, by all means. I mean, time is money.
Don't you also need a certain amount of CO2 to actually seal a keg? Put 3 pounds of CO2 in a keg?
Well, it depends on whose keg.
Yeah. Did you use keg lube, John? Okay, so let's move on to the next one. Bottle conditioning scavenges all headspace oxygen. I've heard this one before too. But like I said before, you don't actually need any oxygen in your headspace in order to carbonate that beer. You're going to get carbonation. You're better off mitigating it. You have a greater risk of leaving some oxygen in that headspace for that'll damage your beer than you do of not carbonating the beer. The beer is going to carbonate. Yeast does not need oxygen in order to create CO2. To ferment, actually, it doesn't need oxygen.
However, it's a nice thing that if any oxygen gets in there, it cleans it.
It is. It
You don't
is.
have to worry
It
about
does.
And so
it. It's not a
it's a good point that Paul brings up here. If you're bottle conditioning, oftentimes you're not going to pick up the oxidized flavors. I noticed when I first started kegging, a lot of my hoppy beers were getting oxidized much faster than I was used to, because I didn't have that extra cleanup phase where the yeast was scavenging some of that oxygen that was in the headspace in the bottle conditioned beers. Once I started force carbonating it, any air, because I wasn't doing closed transfers at that point, any of the oxygen in that headspace was starting to oxidize my
But you
beers
know, as
faster.
you're going through this presentation, I'm thinking, wouldn't it, it's gonna clean it up in a keg too? Because unless the yeast is completely dead.
No, because when you keg it, you usually throw it in a chest freezer to force carbonate it, because it force carbonates better when it's cold.
That totally kills all yeast.
Well, the yeast is going to be so inactive, you're not going to be able to carbonate off of that. Plus, you don't re-pitch sugar in when you're force carbonating, so it's not going to have anything to eat up.
If you put corn sugar in it and the yeast aren't active, it's gonna be sweet and bitter. That's actually good.
Okay, so the next common misconception, I think I've actually said this before back in my younger and stupid days, was that I was going for a nice oxidized sherry note in my beer anyway, so why do I have to worry about oxygen? And while that's true, so the sherry flavor that you get out of like some old ales and stuff like that does come from a oxidation process. And so that comes from oxidizing the melanoidins, so that's why you get something like an old ale that's got a lot of crystal malts or stuff so an old ale that's been boiled for 2 hours or 3 hours or whatever. It's got a lot of those melanoidins. It's really the percentage of melanoidins versus everything else that's creating more of a obvious sherry note to it. So my issue with using that as an excuse is that you can't target just those melanoidins, right? You're going to oxidize everything that's in that beer. So all your fatty acids, your lipids that are also coming from malt, are also going to oxidize and make it taste like cardboard as well. So you're much better off just letting time do its thing if you're going for those sherry flavors, and just letting what little oxygen's in there work on the melanoidins without trying to add anything extra. You're more likely you're going to ruin the beer than make it taste like an awesome sherry bomb. Okay, almost done with the talk, and then I'll do just a brief presentation. So the equipment you need, if you guys keg, you've got most of this already. Well, you probably don't have the last couple, but other than that, all you need is a clean keg, CO2 tank and regulator. You need just standard liquid and gas transfer tubing, hose clamps. You got to make sure that all your seals are nice and tight, but you should be doing that anyway if you're kegging. A racking cane. The prices have come way down, even on these stainless steel ones. I saw them on Amazon for like $8 a piece now, so there's no real reason to even go after the plastic ones anymore. A multi-port carboy cap. I just brought one of these in. I don't use this all the time, but a lot of people use this, so it's pretty common. You see these in homebrew stores. They've got 2 little ports on the top, and one you can slide a racking cane into, and you can fit a hose over the other one. They're stiff enough where you could put a little hose, or what are those called? Hose clamp, thank you, around it to tighten it down on the other end if you want to attach a tube to the other end. I have used this before, it works well. But for my demonstration, I just have a bung that I've customized, and I'll go over that a little bit more. And a spunding valve. Does anyone here know what a spunding valve is? I'm sure lots of people do.
What do you need a spunding valve for?
You don't need a spunding
Okay,
valve,
good.
but if you're going to do a truly closed transfer, you should have one. So a spunding valve, what that does is it controls when you're filling up a keg, and you have to let gas out in order to put the liquid in, right? When it's a closed up keg, a spunding valve is going to slow down and control the amount of gas that's exiting the keg. So if you just open up your valve here, your pressure release valve, assuming you have the sort of keg top that's got a pressure release valve, like that, if you just open it up, if it's got positive pressure in the keg, the theory is that no air is going to go in, right? Because all the air is getting pushed out and none can go back in. I don't know if I necessarily believe that, especially if you end up losing pressure, then air can start to circle back in again. So I like to use a spunning valve. It leads a little bit more control to the process. Also, if you've started to carbonate in your fermenter, which some people do, I wouldn't recommend in glass, but then you can keep that pressure, you can keep the beer from foaming up when you transfer it if you use a spunning valve and set it to a certain pressure so that your keg is always at like 3 pounds of pressure, if that's what your fermenter was set at.
But you wouldn't use that to push the water out, or you would?
A spunning valve to push the water out? No, I mean, I'm going to use it now
Gas coming out of the keg.
just for the gas. I mean, water's
He's gonna
good
push
through the spunning
gas
valve.
out.
Okay, you're not pushing, where is
He's
it?
already pushed the water out. Now
Oh, it's already done.
Now the cake just.
Okay, let's do the demonstration. This is my last
Yeah.
slide.
What if you have a
Yeah,
pail
show.
You have a what?
pail fermenter instead of a pail?
Oh, a bucket?
Yeah, you can't do a closed transfer with a bucket. Well, I mean, I get you. If you had a good enough seal and lid on it, maybe you could. I don't know. Yeah, that's the other thing. If you're fermenting you should get a fermenter that's got a nice small top on it that you can put you can seal it up better. Okay, so when Mike was up here talking, I already started this demonstration. This keg was all filled up with Star San. So your first step is to fill your keg completely to the top. You don't want any headspace whatsoever. I usually put it over a towel and let it like even drip out the top. Any headspace in there is going to create the atmosphere, and the atmosphere is 21% oxygen, right? So you're going to be adding air in. I've heard some pretty crazy stories about people even pre-boiling their water that they make their Star San with to deoxygenate it.
Wow.
That presentation that I sat through at NHC, the guy talked about it. It sounded like he was advocating for it, but I mean that's a little extreme if you ask me.
Even
But
if it's still?
Yeah, yeah.
he didn't say anything about
If it's distilled, if it's been exposed
So
to
like
oxygen,
Koreans
it can start pulling oxygen out of the air.
But yeast is going to eat that oxygen in the water, so and when you boil it, those bubbles.
After I transfer, I'm hopefully not going to have too much yeast left in it. So anyways, this Star San here obviously wasn't made with distilled water. You can tell it's got that nice Cleveland minerally look to it, as everything is, the Star San doesn't last, it gets cloudy right away. When I'm doing this, I usually don't waste money on distilled, I just use tap water because I'm going to toss it out right away. Typically I just fill a keg, 5 gallons of Star San, and then I dump it. So this will go like right into a drain or right into a bucket that I dump. But instead for this demonstration I put it into this glass carboy. We're going to pretend what's in here right now is your wort that you're ready to transfer into the keg. So, but the first step of this would be to fill up this keg with Star San all the way to the top and then push that Star San out so that all that's left in that keg is CO2. Right? So the next step, this is pressurized still, by the way. If you immediately hook it up here, it's going to start blowing bubbles, right? So I've got like 20 pounds of pressure probably in there right now. So yeah, that would be really bad news if you're about to transfer. You've got a nice clear beer in your fermenter. You skip secondary fermentation. You know, it's just in the primary, so you got a nice thick yeast cake at the bottom. And I'm talking from experience. If you forget to do this, it's going to immediately kick everything up, cloud up your beer. And of course, motion is one of, so there's basically 3 things that are going to accelerate any chemical process, but oxidation for sure. It's going to be motion, heat, and time. So just by stirring it up like that, splashing it up, it's going to increase the amount of potential oxidation that could happen too. So you want to avoid that at all costs. That's sort of homebrewing 101. Even when you're bottling, you're always told to try to avoid splashing. I try to avoid it even with closed transfers. I don't try to move stuff too quickly. I try to keep the temperatures pretty even. I mean, I'm going to cold crash that keg after I fill it, but for the most part, I try to keep it a relatively slow flow rate and keep the temperatures kind of room temperature. So the first thing I do is find my spunning valve. There's all sorts of different kinds of spunning valves. This one's got a little regulator on it. It's a 1 to 30 pound pressure regulator right there that tells you what's in the tank. Yeah, and then it's got one of these where you just twist it, and this twist dial here will let you know how many pounds of pressure is going to be released out of this little valve right here. So I'm going to hook it up to this keg. You're not going to hear anything right away. Okay, and now I'm going to twist this until I start hearing the air release.
You guys hear that?
So I'm going to open that up almost all the way because I want to let almost all the pressure out. By using this funding valve, it's not going to allow air back into it if it's working correctly, as long as I don't open it up all the way, as long as I leave it at like a couple pounds. But the point of this is that I want to release most of the pressure so it doesn't bubble up in here more than I absolutely have to. Okay, so the next step here, this is a little modification I did that you don't have to do. It's going to cost a little bit of money, especially if you get a Star Sand version, but this is just a carbonator cap. If you guys have heard of those, you can screw them onto little 20-ounce bottles to quick carbonate some beer. But I attached it to a little tube here just because it makes this whole transfer process that much quicker. Connected that way. It's basically just making a quick connection.
You want to make sure your gas is up. It's like a 3-day.
Oh yeah, good point. Well, this is already on. This is off. Yeah. So I want to make sure my gas, thank you Mike, is turned all the way off when I start this process, and then I'm going to slowly turn it up. Especially if you're using a glass carboy like this, because these will shatter if you put more than a couple pounds of pressure in there. I think technically they recommend you don't put any pressure in it, but
Let's try it.
what's the worst thing you can happen, right?
Andy, move that. Is your bung loose?
Everybody please put on your seatbelts.
That's right, I'm recording.
Okay. Alright, so most of the pressure should be out of this keg. So this is turned off, even though it's wide open, I've turned it off. So now I'm going to connect the liquid. This bung is a little loose here. You're going to want to hold that in. One of the good things about using this style instead is that it can hold on by itself. These little carboy caps, because it's got a little lip that goes over the edges here. If you're using a bung like I do, you got to kind of hold it down so that it doesn't keep trying to pop off with the pressure.
Someone hold it for you?
I got it.
Mark, hold it.
Yeah, Mark's a whole corner.
Tape the microphone to his
He's a bung
chest.
holder.
Okay, so nothing's moving yet because the gas is off. So,
Mic around your neck.
Mark, can someone help me? Since you just offered?
Ooh,
All right.
Up in there.
up to 100?
No, not up to 100. Okay, so you only want a couple pounds. I'm gonna hold down the bung. If I wasn't holding a mic, I could do this myself.
Mark, can you stand on the other side so the video can get the action here?
So there we go. Stop. So just enough where the liquid starts flowing out, and you guys can hopefully see that the liquid's flowing out. This takes about 10 minutes on a couple pounds of pressure to empty 5 gallons out of this carboy. If you move your hand off this bung, it's immediately going to shoot off. I don't know if any of you remembered a few years ago, Pete did a presentation on closed transfers. And with his system, his regulator, I don't think let him go down to a low enough PSI, so it was constantly trying to burp off like that. But if you have a good regulator, it should be able to go down to like 1 or 2 pounds, and you should be able to hold this shut so that it doesn't constantly burp. Anytime you basically break this seal and it burps, you're potentially risking any kind of oxygen jumping back in.
When you did that, that's cool.
Yeah.
Well, why don't you use the orange cap?
You could. I have used it. It's just
But
another.
I understand. Why aren't you using it?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, and
Isn't it so much an offset?
Well, I don't like the orange caps because it's hard to get the
Yeah, it's
the racking cane in, because you got to go the other way with the racking cane. You can't slide the orange cap. I haven't figured out how to do
You
it.
gotta get it wet.
Yeah, and you got to get it wet. You got to. So if I could put the orange cap on the top and slide in the racking cane from the top, I would do it. But because the top of that orange cap is tapered up, you got to go in from the bottom.
Trim it off.
Now, I put mine in from the top, but I keep mine in a bucket of Star Sand. Right, my Star Sand stays in a bucket, so I'm able to take all those parts and shove them in the bucket,
I've been using a
get
vacuum
them all
pump.
wet and slimy and sloppy.
Hey, I'm not against using those cardboard caps.
They are safer because they will pop off. If you get that bung stuck in there, nothing's gonna move it out of there. Even though you say it will, if you get it stuck in well enough.
60 pounds worse than having CO2.
So,
Now,
I can see that's going down.
We break
Right,
glass
so-
or shoot bugs. It's an IED.
So keep the questions coming. We've got another 8 minutes or so.
well, the other thing I suggest is a bar to flare pitch.
Okay, so one thing I don't like about this is, it's probably going to lead into what you just brought up, is that I have to actually, when I have an airlock on the top of this, like a standard airlock stuck into a bung, I have to take that off. I have to open this up. It's not a completely closed transfer the way that I'm doing it, unless I hook this whole thing up to some kind of blow-off tube and fermenting it this way with this gear put in. Now there are ways where you can use a carbonator cap or some kind of customized little bung like I've got, and you can hook up things to it. So if it's probably an extra $20 worth of little gadgets you hook up to it, where you can actually attach an airlock to it, so that you don't have to take break the seal, take anything off, and then slide this in.
So this is when like a tri-clamp is like.
Tri-clamp would be awesome. Yeah. Yeah, if you've got the money for a nice stainless conical with tri-clamp fittings and everything, where you can just pop in and out accessories, that's the best way to do it.
A safety valve.
Wow, you don't need a safety valve. They're both pressurized containers. I mean, that thing's rated, your conical's rated at 15, that's rated at 60, you're fine.
Sorry, guys.
I was going to turn up the pressure.
It's pretty slow. When you're spun
Explode. I mean, it'll make great video.
You just dive the spun valve.
Do you do this for every beer?
That's a good point. So someone asked me earlier, didn't ask me, but sort of made a comment like, "Oh, if you make hoppy beers, you got to do this." I do this for every beers. I do this for lagers. Any type of beer can oxidize. Any type of food product, any type of beer, oxygen and oxidation more so is your enemy. So, yeah, I definitely do this for every beer that I ferment now.
And I would think if you've got like a high ABV beer that you're going to have in your teaser for a year or more, it becomes even more important.
Yeah, definitely. So that's why I'm saying lagers sort of got me into this mindset where I had to do this. When I started noticing oxidation in my lagers, I was thinking, all right, I got to keep the oxygen out of this process more. And lagers, it's a longer process. I mean, there's shortcuts you can take, but for the most part, it's a longer process to ferment a lager. That's just more time. Yes, Jim?
So,
Yes, Jim?
So you said you started doing this with lagers. I presume you're lagering in a keg.
I'm not.
So you're lagering in.
I usually lager in glass, but you can lager in kegs, sure.
So if I'm going to push this off, so I lager in kegs, and I've got the dip tube cut just a little bit shorter.
That's perfect, because you've already got the ball lock connections to do the transfers.
But I'm leaving, so when I push then from the lagering keg to a serving keg, that's a close transfer.
Yep.
But of course, it's going to leave a little bit in the lagering keg, right? I'm going to leave, I don't know, maybe half an inch of beer in the bottom and other drags. If I'm going to push Star Sand out of that, I'm going to end up, when I push my lager from my fermenter into my lagering keg, I'm going to be leaving a half inch of Star Sand back.
Yeah, half inch might be a bit much. So you flip it upside down and open up your release valve. That's not really closed anymore, though.
Bucket. Oh, yeah, sure. Because it's going to spray absolutely everywhere.
Yeah, but you open up your release valve, and that's
Got it.
and draining out all the pressure. That's immediately going to allow some potentially atmospheric pressure to re-enter that keg.
Before you drain the pressure, you're draining the liquid.
Your business and build out the gas.
Yeah, the gas still has
But I put 3/4 of my.
Yes, sir.
Just to clarify, so if you didn't have the funding valve in there, you would need to be periodically bleeding pressure off the keg, right?
Pretty periodically, unless you just left it wide open, which would still be better than nothing. This would still be much better than having an open keg top and just, racking into it with a wide open.
I leave mine wide open, and I sit there, and when I first started doing it, I was nervous the way you are, and I sat there and I would spray star sand into that PRV on top, and it's always coming out.
Yeah.
There's constant stream of bubbles if you have star sand in that PRV.
Yeah.
So I permit in stainless steel fermenters.
Why do I use
So why wouldn't you? I pressurize my kegs or purge it with
I'm going in
CO2
there
first.
Yeah.
I have not used my funding valve for a gas station.
That's a good point that Mark brought up. When you're transferring into your keg this way, you want to go into the liquid out pin. You don't want to splash it in through your gas. That might be kind of obvious, but when you're filling this keg, you definitely want to hook it up to the liquid pin so that it's going down that cane down the keg and filling from the bottom of the keg up, as opposed to just tossing it in the top and having it splash down at the bottom.
That is way slower than when I siphon.
I could turn up the pressure, but this is glass and I'm not going to risk it.
I get that. I'm just thinking there's got to be some method where, so when I siphon, oxygen's free flowing. It's oxygen free flowing in to displace the work that's coming out. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's going through a filter. I had an inline filter in there, but why would that take more? Because it's atmospheric pressure.
Because of the spunding valve, it's pushing back a little bit of the pressure on the release. If I open this up,
So
if I just
the spunding
opened
valve
up this,
also controls the volume that can get released, not just the pressure level.
Correct.
That affected.
well, yeah,
So you're saying by me just purging my keg with CO2 only and then going directly with a hose from the wall valve into the keg, I'm still getting oxygen in there because
Yes.
I didn't purge it.
yeah.
I mean,
It's still better than not.
I wish we had colored CO2
I'm
so I
like
could
it's
see
better
how
than
it
not.
sounds.
It's 11.
Yeah. I mean, do whatever you can to avoid oxygen, but yeah, you're still risking it. There's still better ways. There's better ways than the way I do it. Yep.
Andrew, what are you doing to purge your transfer hose? It's full of oxygen.
Leave it to the pro brewer to ask me about purging my transfer
I was
hoses.
putting that at home. I was purging before I was working.
He's sucking on them.
So I've definitely heard that before, and only from pro brewers is make sure you tell them about purging the transfer hoses too. And it's a valid point because your transfer hoses have atmosphere in them. So my hoses get purged when I empty out that star sand tank. So I'm using the same hosing when I'm purging out the star sand tank.
How are you keeping them purged when you put it in?
It's not perfect. Yeah, it does open up a little bit when I lift it out of that bucket
I mean, I know what I do.
and then put it into the fermenter. Yeah, there's some exposure there.
How do
You
you
can
avoid
taste
okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, what?
How do you avoid overfilling your keg?
Put a rag on top.
You got to know how much is in your
Or a
fermenter.
scale.
Put it on a scale, weight 40 pounds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the weight.
Well, but that's a good point because if you get a spunding valve, you don't want to shoot liquid out the spunding valve because that is really difficult to clean.
But the big deal here, I mean, we're getting a little anal here, is the big deal is to fill the keg up with liquid,
Pre-boiled star sand.
sanitize, whatever, pre-boil, whatever, and push it out with CO2.
As opposed to purging. Yeah.
And you're way ahead than what we've been doing forever.
Right, but if at that point you then just leave the top of the keg open and fill it,
The regular atmosphere is going to mix back in.
you're still better, but it's still going to mix it.
I don't believe that. It's not a vacuum. How is air going to rush back into this? If CO2 is in there, how I don't know how that works.
You'll have an
It's like the
exchange.
bulb
Someone
don't
explain
fall.
the ideal gas
You'll
line.
have an exchange at the top, especially just
That's
with
right,
the whole
right, I
off
agree.
that lid. You'll have an exchange from pulling out the lid So even if you only have an exchange in the first 6 inches, that's still a lot of oxygen. Let me put this another way. The space, so if you have 2 tri-clamp butterfly valves, back to back, that space between the 2 butterflies, even if you have one side CO2 purge, the other side CO2 purge, that space between the 2 butterfly valves, when you connect the tri-clamp, that is enough to put 50 parts per, or 50 ppm of oxygen in a 100-barrel tank.
So we're almost done here. I'm going to pretend like I'm approaching, the yeast bed that's at the bottom. So I want to stop this before I start picking up yeast. So you don't want to wait until it starts pulling up gases. So what I'm going to do, you don't want to just lift this off. It's going to immediately start sucking air in. You don't want to do that. So the first thing you do to stop this is just to pull off the liquid pin off of the keg.
Just do that.
Do that and you're pretty much safe. Now you can release this. I'm going to turn off my CO2 tank, unplug my spunning valve, and no one died.